there's so much to cover, and I know you've done a lot of great interviews, Richard, with Scott Atkins, with Kung Fu Genius, and you told some of these stories I'm going to ask you about already, but I still think it's important to talk about them because it all kind of starts with you training martial arts. I believe you started judo at age 11, right?
Correct.
Can you tell us how you got involved in the martial arts world and how that kind of led to karate and then eventually working security with all those big rock bands, which we want to dive into because some of your other interviews, you don't talk too much about that. And I know you mentioned, oh, I want to write a book someday, and we're gonna, talk about what kind of book, because it's not the kind of book where you want to just spill all this stuff that shouldn't be talked about. It's actually a much more interesting, positive book. But let's start with the martial arts, like the judo training. How did you get involved in that early on in Australia?
Well, and again, as you said, I've done some previous interviews, and apologies to those who hear this again, but obviously I can't recreate different stories as far as the origins. So if you're hearing this again, apologies. But I started at 11, and I literally started as an interest through comic books. In Australia back then, we didn't really have martial arts per se. The only thing that we're aware of, or at least I was aware of as a kid, was judo. And there were ads on the back of comic books, and you probably remember the traditional ads of, one skinny little guy defeat five opponents, with a flick of a wrist or whatever. And I just remember being intrigued by the whole notion of that. And my interest started when a kid called Morris Yeomans moved into a house opposite to where I lived. And again, this is when I was not quite 11. And Morris was disappearing 2 nights a week because we'd go to play pool sometimes, in the local areas and all that sort of stuff. And I'm paraphrasing, but I asked him where he's going. He said he was going to judo classes. And that just immediately piqued my interest. And I said, oh man, I want to go. So I ended up going to these classes. There was a suburb called Nunawading. It was a Nunawading police sergeant that was running the classes, just a few nights a week, community hall type thing. So I went along and joined in the classes, and I always laughed that I was very skinny and very small as an 11-year-old, and I was just like cannon fodder for the older teenage judo practitioners and been doing it a little while, and I was chucked from one end of the dojo to the other. But I remember just thinking, this is fantastic. Um, so I did that for a while. And by the way, I want to say that, a lot of people have different beginnings in martial arts, but Sergeant Burge was his name, but he was a very nurturing and very caring instructor. So I also feel fortunate that my introduction was a good one, was getting somebody that really cared about their students and everything else. Anyway, high school where I went to, there was another kid that I went to school with who suddenly told us about a karate demonstration that's going to be happening 3 miles from where we lived. And I would have been maybe 15 then. And we went along to this demonstration. It was run by Tino Seberano, a Hawaiian Filipino. He'd only been in Australia maybe 6 months. And he was from the Goju lineage under Yamaguchi. So not so much the Okinawan Goju, but the mainland Goju from mainland America, Japan. So anyway, we went along to this demonstration, and I still remember how awestruck I was. It was very basic demo, H pattern kata, a little bit of jukumite or sparring that they used to do on in the mainland. And I just remember thinking, God, this is just what I want to do with my life. And as they say, careful what you wish for, but that's pretty much how it's turned out. So I started training immediately with Tino Hunchi, and the thing that attracted me about the karate then was being small and still not big in stature. Obviously it involves speed, it involves, kicking and punching, keeping range as opposed to the grappling range of judo. So it just appealed me, if nothing else, for those reasons. And that's what started my journey. And we can go on and on. Of course, I a gentleman to quickly fill it in. Bob Jones started with Tino at the same time I did in the mid 60s. Bob was 10 years older than me. He also had incredible reputation as a street fighter, as it were. I don't mean that in a bad way, but in the terms of reality based. And Bob used to run security in Melbourne with a lot of the clubs. I always laugh when I say that we ran a lot of the discotheques. That really dates me. But so Bob wanted to leave in the early 70s and start up his own system, very much like the American eclectic system, where you would incorporate boxing, judo, various other sort of combat arts along with the traditional karate. And he wanted to make it in line with servicing the sort of people that work for him on the doors, as bouncers or doormen, etc. And so we were a bit of a precursor to mixed martial arts in a way, because we were looking not just at the traditional, but what would actually work, if it became real. And that was in 1970, and off we went. It was called Zen Do Kai. It's still going today. There's still hundreds of clubs here. I'm still overseeing and mentoring a lot of the people in that system, along with Bob. And off we went. 78, Bob went to America and met Chuck Norris, met Joe Louis, who people would
Wow.
remember, legendary Joe. Organized to bring Chuck Norris out to Australia to do some demonstrations. Chuck had just done Good Guys Wear Black and Breaker Breaker, one of the very early films. So he came out to Australia, demonstrated on the same card. I was demonstrating Sai and bow and Okinawan weapons. And we demonstrated each of the states in Australia. Chuck and I just got on amazingly well immediately. He said, if you ever get to California, make sure you look me up and we'll do some training, which you could imagine for a kid, growing up in a suburb of Melbourne, Australia, that was an amazing invitation. And I never thought I'd actually get to California, and again, I'm covering a lot of areas here, but I was already working as a bodyguard for rock and roll bands. Linda Ronstadt wanted me to go out and work for her full time in the US. And so in 79, I moved to California, called Chuck, and the rest is history. Started training with Chuck, and that's how I met Benny the Jet Urquidez and Yamashita Sensei on the Octagon set and Fumio Demura, and the list goes on and on. And yeah, that's it in a
All the
nutshell.
legends. I got a question. You gotta share like what the typical training day with Chuck was like back then.
This is a story that must be told.